Okay, so I'm Zayden, and I'll be presenting from Moment 212 the Clueless, and I'll be talking about a little bit how we prepared for Worlds, and this will also apply to just your normal like regional championship or any competition where you have judging and like high levels of competition. So the first part that I'm going to talk about is on judging and how you should, as a team, like can prepare for judging to fully optimize how your team comes off to the judges. Uh, this is something like how we prepared to go for the Inspire Award, which we won for our division at the World Championship. And it's something from our experience that I think is very important. So some assumptions to start off of with for Worlds is, first of all, robot performance is usually not the biggest factor for Inspire as long as you do reasonably well, i.e. as long as you're like within the top, like, I don't know, 10 or so teams in your division, you probably are like in the running for Inspire already. So you don't need to have like the #1 robot to get the Inspire award. And second of all, everyone has similar levels of outreach, even if the actual events are different. Like everyone has some major event and a bunch of minor events, and I'll get to this later. So one thing that's really important is framing your outreach narrative. So typically, a lot of top teams have a lot of common pieces of outreach, like FLL mentoring, demos, etc. This might be different for Romania, but I know, like at least here in San Diego, all of these things are pretty common. And so some of like the strong teams have major events, which typically distinguishes them. So for example, like Technicobots last year had their fly set program, which they've had for several years. And when Wolfpack won their Inspire Award at Worlds, they had some like very unique Africa outreach that they did. And so focusing on one major event is always like more strategic than focusing on two or to more than one major event, because you have to split the time that you talk about it in half. When you go into judging, you have a limited amount of time to basically talk about everything that you did over the season. So you have to pick the most impactful and unique pieces of outreach that are actually going to help you and make you stand out. So as a result, outreach should be packaged into what I like to call like a central narrative, where every initiative is feeding into that one narrative, which allows you to group these sort of different outreach events together and present them all at once. And that way you can bring up bigger numbers because you can merge all of these individual events together. And it also allows you to give a broader overview of everything you did, which means, again, you spend less words, but you talk about you hit like all of the different outreach things that you want to talk about, and they can actually remember it. Because if you do the alternative, I guess, which is just listing each different outreach event that you did and like what the individual impacts are, they'll remember a couple of them, but they're not going to remember everything. So especially because these judges typically don't take notes on everything you say, having a central narrative means that they remember what it is that you talk about. They'll remember the narrative, and then that way they'll remember the things that you did within that. Okay, so what matters most? Basically, how the judges perceive you compared to other teams. Because, like I said, a lot of these teams are at the very same or similar level of competition, which means that you have to make yourself stand out. There are several ways we can do this, and it's listed here, and I'm going to go into all of these in depth. Okay, so the first is judge appeal. Basically, you need to put yourself in your judge's shoes. If you're in a panel of 3 judges and one of them is a FTC alumni and 2 are volunteers, then focusing and appealing to the experienced judge is more strategic because that judge is going to be more active in judge discussions. So generally, like prioritizing these kinds of judges is a good idea because they like typically lead judging debriefs. So prioritizing them is good. However, the volunteer judges, although they're less experienced in terms of like the very specific details, you also have to try to sway these judges as well, because especially if they're the majority of your judge panel, if they like another team better, it'll hurt your chance for Inspire. So you need to appeal to each of these judges. From my experience, if you just answer each of their own questions and appeal to them, i.e. if a technical judge asks a technical question, you should probably give a very detailed answer. But if one of the less experienced judges who's probably like volunteering or something ask a broader question, you should give a broad answer with broad overviews and specific, like big numbers, i.e., how many people you impacted, how many hours you spent, money raised. Okay. Beyond that breakdown of like the experienced and volunteer type of judge, there are a lot of specific scenarios where appealing to judges can be helpful. So, for example, in our world judging, we had an FRC alumni, and so we decided to talk about a coaxial swerve judging, which, like, the question was pretty much what is something that you could do in the future if you had more time. And while this is probably not something that we would have actually done, giving answers that appeal to the judges, uh, even though like we had never planned this, can be very good because this judge later expressed lots of interest for us, and I think vouched for us heavily to get inspired in our division. Another thing, judges will always remember the very beginning and the end much more than what you say in the middle. So your biggest numbers and the things that you want them to take away needs to be centered either at the start of your presentation or at the very end. And at these parts of the presentation, your rhetoric is very important. So for example, Wolfpack had this piece of rhetoric that outreach is not out of reach. And this is good because it allowed them to talk about their team goals and their outreach narrative. So formulating these pieces of rhetoric before you actually go to competition, and just knowing that there are like these lines that can help the judges remember and make you stand out more, it can be very useful. Here are some rhetoric formulas that you can use. I'm not going to go through all of them, but like for example, you can ask a question and then answer it in the same line, and that also helps the judge like question it as well if they're already not doing so. Word efficiency. So as I mentioned before, basically judging is a game of time. You have limited time to sell yourself, and everyone has pretty much the same amount of time. That means that you have to use your time very efficiently. You don't want to ramble on about the same thing over and over about. Like you can talk about some major initiative and not be talking about supporting events, which maybe that is strategically good for you if you deem that that event is the most important. But if you can be more efficient with the words you choose, it allows you to cover more major events and also have time for the minor events. So when you do like practice Q&A, practice judging, etc., you can catch yourself using like filler words, or if you see that you can say the same thing in maybe like 5 less words, then practicing like using less words will save time in the long run and allow you to be more efficient with your judging. Some more narrative stuff. If you have a lot of outreach events, but nothing tying them together, that means that it's messy. So you want to still group them into a single narrative, which makes it much more easier and more efficient to present. So for example, you can be focusing on marginalized communities, and you did this through X, Y, and Z. And those are like 3 different outreach initiatives that you did, but you group them under this one narrative, which you can then repeat throughout your judging and make sure that it gets in their head. Again, they're probably not taking notes. The best way to get them to remember it is to say it multiple times. Robot narrative is also very important. So beyond outreach, you also need to make sure that your robot is unique. So you want to see what other teams have ahead of time and see why your robot is unique and center your presentation around that. So for example, in the center stage season, there are a lot of extendo intake robots in our division. And so we focus on how our intake was the best of both worlds. We had a drop down, but it was a bigger drop down than most teams. So we just said that this is the best of both worlds because we can get the extra reach, but it's not as complex. That was not necessarily true. Like extendo intakes were probably like a better intake design overall, but as long as you say it, it gets put in their head, and like these judges are either going to have to make the comparison themselves, or you can just tell them why you should prefer yours over like another team's. And so when you actually do that comparison yourself, it means that they don't have to do the work and you do the work for them, and they will probably like your design better. Yeah, on like clash. So basically this term clash is when you are going after another team's design or outreach, you have to make sure it doesn't come off negatively, because like gracious professionalism is important. You can't just say like we don't think any other extended, or we don't like extended designs. This specific team is like not a good robot, right? You have to phrase it in a like positively worded. So things like, we thought of doing an extend out the start of the season, but we decided not to because like, I don't know, like it was too complex, and so we thought that we could do this design instead, which is a better design for like 3 reasons. And you list those reasons, and you can see how the way I phrase that, it's not negative against other teams. We're saying we considered it, and these are reasons why our design is better than their design, even though we never mentioned that this is another team's design. Yeah, again, when it comes to robot judging, all robots are different, which means that judges have to pick between the aspects of the robot that they like the best. Don't make them do it themselves, just do it for them. Presentation specifics. Again, need to sell the judges. Uh, our script has been pretty successful. I believe it's on our YouTube from the Freight Frenzy season, and we've used it for the past 2 years, and it's worked well for us. Obviously, if you have a presentation that's worked well for yourself, like you don't need to change it that much season to season. You can just change the specifics. But judging is a prerequisite to getting pit judging, because at least for how it works in San Diego, the judges will then debrief and choose which teams they think should get the pit judging, or at least the majority of the pit judging. So that means that your presentation needs to come off very well, even if it's more than the actual content. It needs to be memorable so that they actually decide to go to your team's pit later on and ask about the specifics. Um, Cold reading the presentation is risky. So yeah, I was talking about this distinction between your experienced like alumni or coach judges, as well as like your volunteer or like parent judges. You don't want to make assumptions, but you can kind of make assumptions from the types of questions that they ask. So like it's possible to cold read the judges, but I wouldn't recommend it. Pit displays. Pit displays matter a lot. When you have pit judges going around, they will remember what stands out. So for example, Roti D2 had like a 200-page book on their robot alone, and I too also had a very organized and spacious pit at Worlds, and like the clean, organized aesthetic setup is perceptually advantageous because these judges see that you stand out, so they will go to you and be more interested. It also needs to be unique. If another team has like a all black pit, like having a dominantly black setup is not strategic. You want to have like different colors. Like for example, Clueless is yellow. There's not many other teams that are yellow. Comparison. So this is more in depth of weighing between different ideas. So for outreach, instead of like just the robot, if 2 teams both did FLL mentoring for their outreach, and the other team has the bigger numbers, then when you are presenting, you should not try to sell yourself on the numbers, because their numbers definitely outweigh yours. Instead, you should focus on factors that make yours better than theirs. So for example, what makes yours unique? Was it more in depth? Like, did you do it multiple times? Was it for marginalized groups? Was the impact like something that is continuously happening after you've left, or was it just something that happened and you didn't go back? These are ways where you can say, where you can make your outreach stand out. Again, you don't want to make it negative. It should always be positively worded when you do any sort of outreach weighing. But so, for example, you can say, we did like FLL camps, and our FLL camps like are unique because we wanted them to be very in-depth, and we prioritized the depth of our programs over the breadth. While other teams do like dozens of these initiatives, we think that having a single initiative is more impactful, because it means that these people are actually impacted over many years instead of just 1 year and one initiative. So here's another example. If it's coming down to raising money, if another team raised like $50,000 and you raise only $10,000, you should not be focusing on the money you raised. You should be focusing on like the specific details of what sets you apart. Conversely, if you did raise the most money, that is what you should be selling yourself on like the magnitude, the numbers. Initial like international outreach is something that a lot of teams try to do, but typically these are like one-off events, i.e. a team can mentor like a team in like South Africa and do that for 1 week before they leave. That is a one-off event. And while judges typically like these kinds of things because it's unique, it's also easy to distinguish your international outreach by saying like you've constantly maintained it. So try to maintain things, have like that depth, and having different ways to compare your outreach, make it stand out. Um, Also, when you plan out your outreach, or even if you've already done it, when you're going into like before competition, just thinking of different ways to where you can talk about how yours stands out is always a good idea because your outreach, you can say it like outweighs for many different reasons. So if you actually give the comparative analysis on like ours is more unique because we for like 3 different reasons, that's better than just saying, yeah, ours is has the biggest numbers. Outreach scouting. So lots of teams post outreach on like social media, or you can find out about events they've done on organizer sites, or during like league meets, you can see what kinds of outreach other people is doing. Similar to scouting teams for the robot game, I think that outreach scouting is important because if you know what another team's outreach narrative is, that means that you can pre-plan your narrative and presentation strategy. So it's kind of easy to predict what other teams' major and minor events are going to be if you know what they've done. So then you can plan ahead of time and see how you can distinguish your events from theirs. And at the worst, you have like the 2 exact same piece of outreach, which cancels out in the judge evaluation. At best, your event is seen as being the better event, even if it has the worst numbers. You just make sure you're comparing it in a way that makes your sound advantageous while also making it positively worded. Not like against them. Don't name drop any teams, but just say like again, our initiative is unique because of like these 3 reasons. How much time do we have? Okay, I just wanted to talk a little bit else about like robot optimization. I don't have any specific slides here, but optimizing for worlds was a process. Like it's a pretty different process because you already are a very strong robot qualifying into worlds. So you're making these very small trade-offs between like reliability and speed. And yeah, typically you have like your specific subsystem of the robot that is holding you back. And so optimizing that is always the best idea. For example, our center stage robot, we had a double claw for our deposit where we could only drop 1 pixel at a time. And this was always slower than the teams that can drop 2 pixels at a time. For example, like AI Citizens, like Row2D2, and Robo Kings, they all had these deposit designs where they could drop both pixels individually and also at the same time. We didn't have that, so we knew that our deposit was going to be slower, but it worked and it was very reliable. At the same time, our intake was not as reliable and it was more limiting. So we decided to spend time optimizing the intake because we knew if we had the intake faster, we'd get a better outcome, even if our deposit was like marginally slower. And I think that worked out for us. You also want to do lots of testing. So we test fired our drone like over 200 times and just logged everything that happened. Do extensive testing and make changes after that, but don't prematurely make any adjustments. Uh, yeah, that's all I have for robot optimization though. So yeah, is there any questions?
Uh, I have one question. How do you ensure your team is ready to adapt to unexpected challenges during Worlds matches?
Sure. So unexpected challenges, as in like robot failures or more like presentation stuff.
Both of them.
Okay. I feel like you should always have people who are experienced with the robot around the robot at all times. So if something goes wrong, you're able to fix it. And also make sure you bring anything and like any tools, any spare parts in case something on the robot goes wrong. So for example, at Worlds, the wire actually broke on our deposit in between matches, but we had the materials and the people who were able to fix it pretty fast. Uh, Again, if you don't have the parts, I guess you can always try asking other teams, and you should probably also have a design that doesn't break so often. Like you can optimize your reliability and the robot strength before the competition to try to prematurely make sure that nothing goes wrong. Uh, I guess like for presentation, if you realize that you accidentally are saying something that you don't want to be focusing on, I guess try to shorten your answer and like then shift focus towards something that you actually want to talk about. So one of these examples is um, both software questions as well as questions about your team dynamics are less important for Inspire because for like to win Inspire, you have to get nominated for like Motivate and Connect for Outreach and the Control Award for software. And then there's like 3 or so awards for like the mechanical side to get nominated for. But those kinds of answers are not going to help you as much. So if they're asking about like how do you manage your time, you typically want to give a short answer and then move on to something that actually matters for Inspire. So if it's an outreach thing, that can be like how you connect with professionals or how you impact your community. And so you either answer an unexpected question that like you don't want to spend time on by giving a short answer, or you give an answer that links in to something that you do want to talk about. So if it's about like time management, you can say, uh, we consulted some experts on how to manage time more efficiently. And through connecting with like these industry professionals, we're able to better optimize like the time we spend and make sure everyone works efficiently. Or it can be like we split up the task based on who wants to do what. And this allowed us to do all of the outreach initiatives that we did. So we had some groups working on this initiative, and then you can explain what you did there, and then explain like the other outreach things that you did. That means that you're answering a question that initially wouldn't help you that much for judging, but you answer in a way where it actually does go towards like your Motivate and Connect awards, which again is what will get you the Inspire award. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, thank you.
I also have a question. How did you manage your time leading up to Worlds, balancing robot improvement, team practice, and outreach?
Balancing time. Yeah. We had a calendar for the World Championship, and we basically planned out before that when everything should be done. So we knew we had to have a lot of time for driver practice and software. So we planned ahead. We should have like 2 weeks to just have driver practice, and then before that, like a week of software optimizations, a week of mechanical optimizations. And also, we weren't doing any active outreach at the time, but like um, judging practice, Q&A practice, those kinds of things. We just plan it out ahead of time, make sure everyone is aware, make sure everyone is actually coming in and coming to those practices. When it comes to the robot specifically, you have a limited amount of time to be working on the robot in a day. So it's never a good thing when both the hardware team and the software team needs the robot at the same time. So even like within every single day, you should break down what hours the hardware team is going to be working, what hours the software team is going to be working, and what hours is going to be driver practice to make sure that there's never any like conflicting times when multiple sub teams need the robot, because that means that people are wasting time and they're not actually getting what they want to get done.
Thank you.
I have one more question. What strategies do you use to scout and analyze other top teams competing at Worlds?
Sure. So for robot scouting, we use like FTC stats a lot, to see like their average scores and like average pixels, like how good their end game autonomous is. We also just watch their matches and just log what happens in the match. at Worlds we didn't really do that extensive scouting because we knew from the start there were like some teams that we work very well with and we want to get with these teams. That's what we ended up getting. But yeah, just see which teams will work well with you, which teams could hypothetically work well with you. Know your strengths and how like they could complement that. I.e., if you are like a very good robot for scoring specimens, you should be looking for teams that are very good with like samples, so that you complement each other. Yeah. Does that answer the question? I could talk
Yeah,
about outreach too if you want.
yeah. And when it comes to outreach, how?
Outreach, most teams just display all of their outreach at once. Even at like league championships or the regional tournament, you can see what outreach other teams have. For the world championship, you can like look on their social media. Uh, you can look at like organizer media. So like in the United States, there's like the STEM advocacy program that a lot of teams go to work with like the government to get STEM funding. And you can look at that website and see a list of teams that participated in that and know that, oh, this team is going to be talking about how they raised $50,000. So we should probably not talk about how we raised $1,000 for robotics. Rather, we should talk about how ours went to like specific communities for specific parts, stuff like that.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Another question I have is, what advice would you give to teams attending the World Championship for the first time?
For the make sure you make a lot of connections beforehand. When the divisions come out, like reach out to other teams in your division beforehand, and just talk with them, get to know them. Having those connections means you will be able to do practices with them, and like it's always nice to have connections for later on after the competition as well. But for example, we were in contact with AI Citizens and TextPan, as well as a bunch of other teams before the World Championship even started. And so we were doing like practices before that to make sure we work together well. Same thing goes for practices against other teams. We actually had scrimmages before the World Championship where it was basically the finals teams. It was us and AI Citizens versus RoTG2 and RoboKings, and we were running scrimmages. But having like those solid connections with other teams, networking with them, and I guess like planning out scrimmages, those kinds of things, that's good. You can also try to share like conference rooms to set up fields in. I know a lot of teams do that, but yeah, just go on like FTC Discord or whatever and reach out to other teams, make connections, network.